What I'll do, I'll give a quick introduction and then pass over to the Deputy Mayor to introduce this CCTP project. We last came to you back in May during lockdown. Seems like a long time ago now, but this is really a work in progress. And we thought it important to go back to you, the stakeholders that we spoke to in May and April, and just really touch base with where we are with this project and some of the feedback we've received and the key changes we've made to the document so far. So there'll be a bit of conversation. Feel free to submit your questions during the webinar. The easy ones we'll try and deal with as we go along, but I suggest we probably leave a good 15 minutes at the end to get to those questions so we don't sort of disrupt the flow. But certainly we will be keen to invite questions from you. I've just been told to let people know this webinar is being recorded, and that's so we can send that out to people afterwards who haven't been able to make it today. So just be aware this is a recording, recording's on now, and also we will be sending out an invite and follow-up questions after the webinar today. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Deputy Mayor just to introduce the project, and while he's speaking I'll bring up the front page of the seminar. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul. That's great. Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks for attending today. As key stakeholders, we really value your involvement and your views. And as you'll know, as Paul's mentioned, we're updating the Central City Transformation Plan, which first came out 2015. And it's really about developing a cohesive strategy for the Central City and planning ahead so everyone knows what to expect. It's an interactive blueprint, really. So the private sector knows what to expect from us. They have some predictability, which is important. And we have an idea of what they are planning so we can work together. The more we know about fantastic developments that are in the pipeline, such as your Union Squares, the better in terms of planning all round. So we've already had one round of engagement, as Paul says, on the plan, and that was really valuable. And we've used that feedback to inform our latest version, and that's what you'll see today. It's a long-term plan, but it also helps us identify what the priorities are, things we can get on with in the next couple of years. And I guess we want to check in with you today just to make sure we've got the priority areas for development right in your eyes. A number of those are along the riverbank at this stage. So this is basically the last cut of what we would take to the long-term plan discussions in the next few months at the council, which is a process of us trying to get funding to do more detailed planning and get on with these projects. I think a real key to this plan is that times are changing in the Central City. We know from your feedback that people want different things from the Central City than in the past. They want it to be more of a people-friendly space, somewhere with very cool public spaces that make you want to hang around and soak it up. They want parts of the city, Central City, to be a place where you can truly relax without feeling cars all around you. Mayor Southgate regards the Central City as one of our top priorities as a council. Her goal is to make the Central City a place where people love to be, and I think that's bang on. I really buy into that as well. And what we need from the Central City also has to change. It will always mainly be a place of business, of course, but more so than ever before, it will become more of a place to live. You just have to look at the government's national policy statement on urban development. Cities such as Hamilton are coming under tremendous pressure to provide more high density housing, including more high-rise apartments if possible, particularly in the Central City. So we spent a lot of time talking about growth cells in the last few years. You will have heard all about Peacock and how we've opened up that growth cell. Of course, there's Rotorua, there's Rototuna, which has been going for many years. Ruakura will get housing too. But more and more, the central city is becoming a growth cell of its own. It has to take a top priority in our city's development and in terms of our spending as well. So a big part of this plan today is based around the fact that we want to encourage more high density housing in the central city. How do we do that? Well, we make it a better place to live for a start. That's a key. And one part of that story, which you will hear about today, is opening up Victoria Street to the river. We know all around the world people are drawn to water. Victoria on the river has shown us, I think, as a city, just what's possible. And so we're really keen to extend that vision in the next few years. Thanks to the wonderful leadership of Momentum Waikato, we're getting a regional theatre in Southern Victoria Street. What we've gone out to you stakeholders with in the last few months and what we've got support for so far is to capitalise on that investment. We have the opportunity, this long-term plan, to look at developing a stretch along the riverbank in what we regard as a cultural precinct, doing something with those properties next to Victoria on the river that we purchased, making fantastic public space either side of the new theatre, linking with the museum, and possibly building a pedestrian cycle bridge across to Memorial Park. These are some of the projects we intend to take to our long-term plan. And there's a wider picture. We're about to start work on a new jetty below the museum. We're excited about the possibilities of more water transport linking the central city with the north and south of the city and with Hamilton Gardens. So once we get sign-off from the council to continue with these projects, we will be looking for partnerships and support from the business community. Some of these projects are not ones that the council can fund alone. We will be looking for help and support. And I'll tell you what, I cannot wait for the long-term plan. I cannot wait to be championing these projects on behalf of the city. I cannot wait for the impact we as a council and you as our stakeholders can make on the central city. So look, I will leave it to our next speakers who are the real experts to take you through an overview of our exciting plans. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And no, that's really good. And it really sort of sets the scene for how the kind of alignment's happening right now with our long-term plan. And this is a rather timely project. So I'd just like to introduce the panelists as well. I didn't do that earlier, so apologies. So with us today on the panel, besides obviously the Deputy Mayor and myself, is Lucy Ryan, who's our Central City Programme Manager. Hi, Lucy. That's obviously testament to the organisation, seeing that there's so much going on in the Central City space that we really do need Lucy, and I'm sure she will be the first to tell you she probably hasn't stopped since she started. So that just shows you the commitment and the kind of the momentum we're building in this project and Central City in general. And then obviously we've got Henry Crothers from LandLab, who's our consultant, who's been helping us pull this together, certainly from a design and landscape point of view, and just really using his knowledge of what other councils have done in this space when you're looking at Central City in a kind of a longer term spatial context. So thanks for being on the panel today, and they'll be available to help me hopefully with some questions and answer sessions at the end of this quite short 1 hour session. So I'll get tracking. This slide here is really just to go over the purpose of the day. Like I said, some of these images will be familiar to you, but we're at phase 2 now. So just really going back to you, as I said earlier, since May, earlier this year, really want to just recap on why we're doing what we're doing, what you've told us from the feedback from the last webinar and the conversations we've had over the last 3 months. And as the Deputy Mayor Jeff's just told you, the sort of key areas of focus that we're gravitating towards given some of the feedback and obviously the existing investments in the city. So aim really is to get the council to endorse this draft plan, and then that will kind of be our framework to go into the LTP funding of projects in the early part of next year, so February, March next year. So as I said earlier, pretty timely. In terms of what we heard first time round, so we went out with quite a sort of reasonably robust draft, given it was way back in May, and some of the key things we had were we're pretty on track with those key messages, and some of them very similar to the Central City Plan that was done in 2015. We obviously, we've kind of consolidate those keywords here for the purposes of the webinar. Not doing your feedback disjustice, but the main document does have sort of a more meaty tome of responses that we got from you, but these kind of 6 key categories is what we heard, and this won't be any surprise to many of you operating in this space daily. You know, we want the city to be a livable, more people friendly. The focus on the river hasn't changed. That's something that's always been very clear over several projects over the last 10 years to turn around and face the river for buildings and active frontages to work more on the riverbank and to try and create that synergy from the river through to the city rather than the two things being treated separate. The aspirational context is we want to develop a spatial framework that goes beyond the current LTP. So that goes to the longevity of having a working document in place. So some of the criticisms in the past is we've done very coffee table type documents, and they tend to not have that kind of time and robustness that we're looking for this time round. So whilst we are focusing, given the current LTP, on the shorter term projects, the aim of this document is to have a 30-year time frame. So I think that's very important to stress in terms of being aspirational. So not what might work in the next 3 years, but also where we're heading in the next 10, 20 and 30. Culture and history, I won't go into the full detail here, but it's very clear that the previous CCTP didn't really address our culture or our narrative and our stories, our mana whenua and our sort of morally key design principles that we're looking to inject into this document and make sure there are opportunities to kind of reveal local stories and places more overtly than we have in previous projects in the city. And there is a lot of work already underway in that space, but obviously this document can certainly have its part to play when it comes to those key design moves that we'll get to shortly. Transport, again, this won't be new to hopefully most of you, that, you know, we need a city that basically plays to a number of transport options, not just the car. We do want multimodal transport injected into the central city space. We want it to have micromobility, be bike friendly, and also identify those key corridors where we can perhaps improve the livability and the operational function of them for a range of users, not just sort of the car user. Still have the car, obviously, but make it more appropriate for multimodal transport options, because that's going to be quite critical as we intensify. Third point, public realm. Again, this is really building on previous good work done in the West Town Belt Plan, but making sure that we capitalize on the opportunities of the River Plan and the West Town Belt Plan and make sure the big chunk in the middle, if you like, that urban fabric, is really looking at the public space. This is a very busy slide, so I won't spend too much. All of these types of documents have a key structure. So they're, like I said, they're very, the front end will have a vision. You have those key outcomes that we took to you last time round, and I'll get to those just to recap shortly. And then we can start getting the middle chunk is key moves and design intent. So that's that kind of spatial focus under the key moves, what we want to do in terms of precincts, city heart, have that keyword stitch that brings the riverfront into the city, and look at the things like the green loop, which is the West Town Belt, the gully network and the riverfront as well. So there's a number of key elements there that we've highlighted. They haven't really changed from last time around. To be honest, we've just refined them slightly. And then the new part is that design intent column. So this is getting into that more granular detail of what we want to do and where in terms of projects. And that's also really because we're not quite at a strategy space yet for those individual kind of circles around character and place and movement. Is what is our key design thinking under those headings, and what can we do to anchor projects to achieve the key moves column. And then really the other two columns is where we start sharing things with pictures and drawings and putting a bit more of a spatial focus. The vision is something that we started off earlier. The previous vision of the Central City Plan 5 years ago was largely focused around vibrancy, which is still important. But what you're seeing now, following the feedback we've got, is this new proposed vision where we still have vibrancy, but also that key part there is thoughtfully designed around people, culture, and the natural environment. So that's picking up on the greater need for people focus, greater recognition of our culture, mana whenua, and greater recognition of natural environment and biodiversity. So these are some of the key things that we picked up on in the feedback back in May. And we welcome your comments during the webinar or in the Q&A later on that vision. The outcomes haven't really changed. In terms of the key kind of headlines, we have refined them. So obviously our place, city for people, compact and vibrancy goes to what the Deputy Mayor's hinted at in terms of having a city where we're basically being told by government it's our key jewel, if you like. We need to intensify, it needs to be compact, but at the same time we need to make sure that all the other strands of a good compact city environment are in place, and that those are the connected blue-green network, resilience and prosperous. So it's not just about density and building height. So I think that's quite key. I'll get Henry to come in a minute after this slide, and he can perhaps talk to those. The key moves, again, is really that spatial intent. So one of the big things I want to get across is this document isn't just about images and pictures, it's how we kind of layer it up as a story around what we want to do in the city space. So absolutely new city precincts. The central city is a big area, it's 130, 140 hectares. We need to break it down so we can manage it into character precincts. That's something that hasn't really changed from 5 years ago, but we're re-looking at that. You know, are we being too rigid in how we look at our precincts, and can we kind of blur the edges of them more so we can be more adaptable and resilient given the current economic situation? A vibrant city heart. This is something that whilst there is an energy on the river, there's a lot of key projects and existing investment, we still don't want to lose sight of all good cities need a vibrant civic heart, and there's been a number of projects over the years that have looked at Garden Place, and we don't want to ignore that, but equally we don't want to rush into doing something just for the sake of doing something. So we've got that on the radar. The green loop is critically important. We've spent a lot of time looking at a West Town belt, but we've never really drawn the picture around that whole circle and proper amenity context on the edge of the city space. I think if we're going to intensify, we need to make sure that future residents have, and office workers, and people living basically above the shop, and anything we can do in terms of density increases. But the offset is obviously we're not going to have large gardens in the city for these people living there, so we need to maximize the use of our public space and make sure that's accessible but also an enjoyable place to be. So that's the green loop slide. The bottom three, I won't go into too much detail, but this is that strand conversation. So it's making sure we pull things from the river across the central city space and then build on the West Town belt, the western edge, the kind of Tristram Street frame. So it's making sure we don't just look at individual parts of the city in isolation of each other. and I suppose I'll think this is probably a good time for you to chip in now, Henry, but this goes to design intent. So that's the layering up of the previous slide, and we'll start talking to some of the maps in a bit more detail.
Sure, thanks, Paul. I mean, I think what that previous slide is showing is what we're trying to do with this design intent section is to take the kind of higher level design principles of those key moves and actually locate and land those as a series of projects and interventions sort of spatially within the city centre, and that sort of helps start to inform a kind of roadmap in terms of how we get from where we are now to actually delivering on the vision identified in the document. So there's a series of 5 thematic layers: character and place, movement, street hierarchy, green space, and built form, which we're starting to develop up with a series of more detailed and more specific projects that contribute to delivering on each of those aspirations. So we're just going to talk through those and explain briefly what each one's trying to do and the kind of projects that have been identified as being able to deliver on that. So the first one is about character and place, and I guess this really touches on this idea of Kirikiriroa and our place and identifying what is unique and special about the city centre of Hamilton. So obviously this plan considers the river and the network of open spaces that encompass and encircle the city centre is really important as informing the character of the city centre, and does make it quite unique and special in the context of other cities around New Zealand. There's also a range of significant cultural sites and places that are important, and being able to understand and sort of reveal the significance and importance of those is going to be pretty key in terms of developing this unique sense of place for the city centre and the stories that the city centre can tell and experiences that it can offer that acknowledge and reveal those places. And so this plan is locating some of those key sites. It's also picking up on the kind of red tone of some of the key precincts within the city centre. The Wintec campus, the spaces around Garden Place, Barton Street, Hood Street, and importantly the Victoria Street axis, and the kind of spaces and places that are organised around that. From a public realm point of view, there's those Civic Square, Garden Place, Victoria on the River, and the network of spaces potentially along that city centre riverfront, which are really important, but also acknowledging that around those spaces are some of the city's key kind of destinations and attractions, and Sky City and the proposed theatre and the museum and the council building and the library are all contributing to this sense of place within the city centre. And I think there's sort of important things here are sort of a line that's running across the page on that Victoria Street axis, and that acknowledging the historical significance of Victoria Street as the former main street of the city centre, and it's really the street that the city centre has sort of grown around, and the city grid has kind of expanded out from that as its kind of starting point. But also running in the other direction across the city centre from the west town belt to the river is sort of the idea of a sort of a cultural axis, which is connecting those open spaces via the Wintec campus, via Garden Place, and spaces like Victoria on the River through to the riverfront. And so thinking about the importance of those key axes as informing what we're doing with the city centre in terms of investment, in terms of the public realm, and in terms of transport becomes really important. And I think this plan also is picking up that around the city centre are some key destinations like Claudelands, to the stadium and to Seddon Park, and how we think about the relationship between those key venues and facilities that provide popular events and attractions, and how the city centre can connect to those and support events and activities that are happening within the city centre as well. I guess the other thing is, just back to that last one, is sort of sitting over the top of this is the idea that there is a kind of network of precincts from the collection of facilities within the West Town Belt, the Wintec campus, which is an important part of contributing to the idea that Hamilton is a university town, and education is an important part of the city centre, and that there's perhaps the opportunity to amplify the presence of that within the city centre. There's a kind of civic heart precinct around Garden Place, which overlaps with the kind of central riverfront, or the kind of cultural precinct, and then that connects you through to the Ferrybank area as well. And so thinking carefully about how the experiences of each of those precincts can be complementary but also different, and that the connections between those places and destinations is clear and legible is really important as well. The next slide is movement, and this is really about, as Paul touched on earlier, this is about thinking not just about cars, but creating a city centre in the future that's more accessible by public transport and by active modes, walking and cycling. And this one's really picking up on the opportunity of some of the key north-south streets within the city centre, Victoria, Anglesey and Tristram, to be more clearly defined in terms of what their role and function is, and their contribution to the city centre. But it's also picking up on how we might access the city centre from the river, which is the blue line coming in from the right-hand side, and potential connections out to the gardens and other parts of Hamilton in the future. It's picking up on the opportunity created by the proposed Ferrybank pedestrian bridge, and linking the city centre across the river to Hamilton East, and to the parks and open spaces on the other side of the river, and creating new opportunities for how you might find your way around and to the city centre. It's also identifying the idea of the green loop and the network of walking and cycling pathways that could connect that green space that wraps entirely around the city centre and connects into the wider walking and cycling networks that will allow people to more easily access the city centre. And it also picks up on what was touched on in the earlier slide about looking at how we can improve connections out to the football stadium and Seddon Park and to Claudelands as part of how those facilities contribute to the life of the city centre too. It was really about creating a city centre that provides more options and opportunity for people to access the city centre and move through the city centre in different ways in the future. I guess the next slide sort of supports that by looking at what is a potential future street hierarchy within the city centre. And I guess one of the things that's come up in the work we've done to date is that there is a sort of a lack of a hierarchy of city centre streets and their typologies and the experiences that they offer. And so we started this process working with NZTA on their network operating framework strategy, which looks at applying a range of different street typologies to the city centre streets based on creating the right balance and combination of movement and place. And so what you're seeing on the diagram here is that we're trying to move towards the idea of a slower speed, more pedestrian priority city centre, which is the kind of the grey tone at the centre of the map, and that within that zone, the street typologies are about being more pedestrian priority and people friendly, and putting people first, and making cars behave differently and drive slower and have less of them in that city centre. So we're really promoting the idea of a really walkable and connected city centre precinct. And so the yellow and the orange are the streets where there's the opportunity for significant change in terms of how those streets contribute to walking and the amenity of the city centre, and supporting the activities of the civic heart in the city centre precinct as well. And then really looking to kind of move the public transport movements and the private vehicle movements outside of those slower speed city centre streets. The next one is really about green space, and a lot of this is looking at reinforcing those connections of the existing green spaces around the city centre, from the Lake Domain to the West Town Belt to the gullies and through to the river, and the opportunities to hopefully in some point explore a connection between those at the southern end of the city centre, so that is a continuous network and you can circumnavigate the city centre. It's about how we deliver on that idea of the green loop, and what we can do to improve the amenity of all of those spaces, and the opportunity for new activities and things to do in each of those sections of the green loop. But it's also important in terms of those green the green arrows. It's the ability to pull the kind of amenity and the ecology and biodiversity of those spaces through into the city centre, and have those kind of green streets that traverse east-west across the city centre and provide those connections and opportunity for green infrastructure and more biodiversity within the city centre. And then it's also, there's a collection in the centre of the plan of really what is the kind of network of more urban spaces, the red lines that provide the connectivity through from the West Town Belt to the River's Edge spaces, which is that kind of network of spaces from Civic Square, Garden Place, Victoria Street, Victoria on the River, and opportunities for new connections that really create a strong connection between the Civic Square, Victoria Street, and those important riverfront spaces which are in the blue there. That this becomes the kind of real focal point of Hamilton's sort of urban public realm, organised around those key destinations, which already exist, but have the opportunity to be improved and enhanced, and really embracing the opportunity of the river and experiences of the river to sort of be pulled into the city centre further. And then the last one is built form and activity, and again we're really sort of focusing on the kind of the central core of the city centre, and looking at what the opportunities are within that central zone for kind of new projects and new opportunities to redevelop some of the existing council sites and or underutilised sites that exist within that sort of 5-minute walk around the city centre. Looking at how we can encourage the buildings that front the river east of Victoria Street to start to turn around and face the river, and offer activities and experiences that embrace the river and provide views and experiences of the river all along that frontage. You know, it's reinforcing the kind of character and scale and grain of Victoria Street as this important main street environment. And also acknowledging that within the centre of the city itself, that there's opportunities for further intensification in terms of both commercial and residential development, and it's starting to identify the types of kind of frontages and activities that will reinforce a more vibrant city centre and good urban design and architectural outcomes. That's sort of a really quick run through those kind of design intent moves.
Yeah, thanks Henry. And look, I appreciate there's a lot there for those viewing, and as Henry said, it's really kind of laying out those key design intents that we think need to be put in place first. So this is really that first part of the journey to get these key design moves and these key outcomes in place. So was the maps you're seeing now probably look a bit sort of, obviously they're two-dimensional, but there's probably more to it than just showing images and pictures, and this is the part of this particular project. We want it to be a working document. We want it to be used by council, but we also want it to be used externally as well, and give that level of certainty of where council's heading and where it's thinking for these particular parts of the city. So with that in mind, I suppose the question is, so what comes next, and what do we need to do to get this lined up, really, to get this in place for council? And these kind of 6 circles here probably aren't the most attractive or sort of earth-shattering implementation items, if I could put it like that, but these are quite critical to line up the bigger stuff. So it's quite clear that we need more design guidelines for the central city. If there's going to be intensification, we want to know what that looks like, where it goes. We want to make sure we have regard to what's there at the moment in terms of our heritage in Victoria Street. We want to make sure it speaks to that amenity, our plan, our cultural precinct plan. So it's making sure that's in place, and that comes to the Māori design principles too. So we'll work with our thought group, our mana whanau, and local iwi, and look at what those cultural significant sites are in the central city space, and make sure that developments are cognizant of those in any future proposals, but also to make sure that council builds in that cultural narrative in any of its discussions when it comes to central city projects or activations. The design panel we have in place already in council, but I think it's become clear that the design panel needs to become more involved in the central city project space, and that's certainly something that council is intending to do. And this document will help frame some of that design panel thinking. At the minute, the design panel use a very generic city-wide document, and obviously I think there'll be a number of areas where the city needs to have more influence and more design panel thinking, and just an external view on some of the projects that get put forward in the city space. It's never a bad thing to have other people who offer up their time to give views on projects, and that's in place now, by the way, but obviously this document will help tell that story when they're looking at future projects in the city. Place and activation plan. So some of this is already in place under Innovating Streets projects when it comes to road corridors, and we'll get to that shortly in terms of particular areas that might already be underway for. But when it comes to that sort of thinking around the future role and purpose of Garden Place, it's really important to do this first before rushing into sort of more substantive projects. So I think that's recognised, and that's something that we want to put in place through this plan, or certainly have it as a recommendation for implementation. As the Deputy Mayor hinted at earlier, Council can't do all this itself, and that's evident by what's going on right now. There's some clear third-party and external partnerships that are very active in the central city space, and that's a very, very good thing. And I think councils are very aware that for future projects to carry on, partnership is a valid mechanism to get things done in this space. And providing you're singing from the same hymn sheet, then that's a good thing to do. So certainly the word partnerships is quite critical to getting some of these key design outcomes and the key principles in place. The regulatory framework, again, it's never a bad thing to review what you're currently using, and certainly in order to anchor some of these key design moves that Henry's just taken you through, we will need to revisit our current Central City Plan chapter of our district plan, and I think we're very aware that that needs to be done very early in the piece, so that will also be one of those regulatory pieces of work that needs to be done. So those are more the operational projects, that slide. So now we get to the more sort of capital focused areas where we're quite keen on sort of progressing through LTP conversations, and certainly some of the feedback has been quite clear to just get on with it in certain places of the city. And just to give you an idea, the blue, the red and the green are kind of those areas where some of the themes that we've come through from feedback have told us to just focus on. So there's clear kind of energy and synergy of leveraging off existing projects in the blue area, which is the riverfront. There's been a number of river plans and ferry bank plans over the years which need to be implemented, or certainly in part implemented. There's certainly a willingness to get moving in these areas. So certainly in the first 1 to 3, or really probably 1 to 5 year time span of this piece of work, we would see that happening. But we're not forgetting the red and the green space, so that speaks to that more holistic view across a longer time frame. So absolutely Garden Place and Ward Street. I don't know whether Jeff, you want to sort of chip in with any sort of thoughts on those key areas that I'm showing there?
I'm hoping it's reasonably self-explanatory in terms of the blue there. I talked about the blue in terms of, you know, I get very excited thinking about the possibilities on our riverfront. You know, I just visualise this wonderful stretch with our wonderful hotels and our awesome casino and Victoria on the river, just flowing down to the, you know, down to the regional theatre and the museum and a bridge. I think, you know, I think there's huge potential there, and then ultimately Ferrybank. So, you know, that's a really exciting part. And Alexander Street, obviously linking in with Union Square, and presentations I've seen on that are just awe-inspiring. The things, you know, the wonderful things it'll do for our central city. So that's tied in with that. Ward Street, of course, there's a lot of work going on Ward Street, and we want to make that stretch of Ward Street as cycle and pedestrian friendly as we can, really, because you know there's a great opportunity for that flow from the Western Rail Trail along Ward Street into the central city and ultimately across. What we do exactly with Claudelands Bridge is still a discussion point. For many years, we've been looking for a great access from the central city to the Claudelands Event Centre, and it's always been in the too hard box, really. There was talk initially about accessing it through O'Neill Street, but I don't think that's the way. So what we do with Claudelands Bridge is somehow we need to create a much better pedestrian cycle link, I think, through there. So that's a priority too. Victoria Street, making it greener, more pedestrian friendly. That's an important one. Yeah. So that probably sums it up, I think, for now.
Yeah, I think thanks, Jeff. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, it's always people want to see the devil in the detail, but there are some sort of key obvious sites in my mind around existing investments in the theatre and making sure that that's not wasted in terms of how we treat the edges and the public space around the theatre entrances and what we do onto Victoria Street. Obviously, VOTR has been a very successful placemaking project, but obviously there's things we can do to make sure there's better linkages connecting the theatre to the Arts Post site and to the museum. So there's a real opportunity there on the riverbank, but not forgetting obviously the key gateways into the city. And I think this is something that's really just come up recently in the kind of whole MPS debate around central city density and increasing the number of people in the city, what that looks like from a city edge perspective. So we've just got a short skip and a jump and we're into Claudelands on one side over Victoria Bridge or Anzac Bridge as it's shown there into Hamilton East, and then to the West Town Belt frame we've got Frankton. So there's some key gateways where we really have to get the entrances into the city and vice versa right for people and the whole movement framework. And so I think that's going to force us to look at what's technically outside of the remit of this particular project, but we can't forget how people come into the city and where they're coming from, because density will happen over the next 30 years and we've got to make sure that people can move around freely and in an enjoyable way and experience those kind of green spaces and the river better than they do at the moment. I'll go to the next slide, and I'm just aware of the time. We're getting close to the end of this webinar. Earlier, the structure set out kind of where we get to in terms of, you know, the narrative, the key moves, the design intent, and the projects and how we try and achieve those. And obviously, the spatial plan is always a useful mechanism. I don't know, Henry, whether you want to have a quick chat to this one. It certainly just shows you that it's not one particular area we're focusing on, and we're trying to get that story going through the city.
I mean, I guess really this is a bit of a work in progress, but just looking at some visualizations that start to communicate the kind of opportunity in terms of you know, improving the public realm, particularly of the sort of civic heart and Garden Place and its connection to Victoria Street, and in turn the connection between Victoria Street and that network of spaces and places along the river's edge. So we're working towards a number of illustrations like this for the plan that will communicate some of those key opportunities, which are of course a combination of projects, as Paul touched on earlier, that are council projects and public realm projects, and a combination of projects that are potential partnerships with the private sector as well.
Great. No, that's it. And why is it all green? People might be asking. I mean, I think there is a focus to perhaps try and Victoria Street to be the more kind of the shared space and pedestrian orientated and focused space, because that's where most of the energy is. That's where your theatre is. That's your main cultural precinct. That's where your main shop front and active frontages are on Victoria Street. So there's a higher level of movement framework in that space towards people. So, but it just gives you an idea that we're not just looking at the riverfront, Victoria Street, what we do in Garden Place, and obviously the civic space outside the council building, and really that journey through, as Jeff mentioned, to the West Town Belt to create a more kind of cohesive movement framework. So yeah, a work in progress, but that's kind of where we're heading towards some of those images there. And just wrapping up, I suppose, and it'd be really good if we could have any further feedback from what you've seen today, but we're planning to sort of take our next iteration to the Central City Advisory Group, which Deputy Mayor chairs, and they're leading and sponsoring this particular piece of work, and with the focus on the river plan and the Central City and all that goes on in those spaces. We'll incorporate any final feedback we get from you, and then the idea is then to pull this document together for a council resolution, and then building into that LTP discussion. So when there is an LTP discussion around where things go in the city and where council focuses its attention, there will be a document in place which shows that we've certainly heard from key stakeholders like yourself, but also our thinking behind where things go and where those outcomes can be best achieved through our project interventions. And also not just council projects, but partnerships and external stakeholder investments. So I think, unless there's any questions and answers that have come through from the externals, I don't know, Lucy, if we got many or whether we can follow up following this webinar, but I think that pretty much wraps up almost on time. I don't know, Jeff, if you wanted to say any sort of closing words there.
No questions. Okay, yeah, well, no, I hope we haven't bored you to death. We're excited about this, and I think that getting the buy-in at the long-term plan time will be crucial, and I guess the support, if you support this plan, the support of the business community and stakeholders will be a big factor in us capturing the imagination of the elected members around the table to get this done. But I'm really confident we will, because there is a real understanding now that the Central City is really where it is at. So yeah, there's a real, I just want to, I guess, emphasise that this council is really invested in the Central City, and really excited. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, Deputy Mayor. I mean, and me too, I hope we haven't bored people off the conversation. And one of the criticisms you often get in these projects is we don't touch base with stakeholders enough, and I think it's one of the key aims of this project is to make sure we speak to you as we move along the journey, and some of it can be a bit overly technical, but it's important that we have these conversations with those people invested in the Central City space, and rather than just share them once the whole thing's done. I've had one question through in terms of any feedback and direction for that. So as I've said at the beginning, this is recorded. We will be sending out the recording to those that have registered with us, and also to those that have provided their email addresses. Plus there will be some sort of just specific further questions on the slides you've seen today. And if we could get any feedback by close of play on the 22nd of September, that would be most appreciated. Thank you for that. Any further questions we get that come in between now and the end of the sort of hour's slot, and anything else we get even after that, happy to follow up and provide answers to those people. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thanks to the panel. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Lucy. Jeff. Also, thank you to the backroom staff that have helped put this together for us today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.